Robert Redford's last moment was far from the spectacle his fame might have dictated. There were no cameras, no hospital room filled with a cacophony of beeping machines, and no adoring fans waiting for one final glance at the man they called a legend. It happened quietly, at his home, on his wooden chair, facing the mountains he loved so much, as the silence crept in and the world slowly faded away. His wife, the last witness to his departure, paints a picture of his final days that is far from the one painted by the public. For her, there was no sudden dramatic collapse, no terminal diagnosis that would have signaled a grand farewell. Instead, it was a gradual withdrawal, a series of small, silent renunciations that only she could truly understand. He stopped reading letters, stopped answering calls, and finally refused to turn on the lights in his room. With each small gesture, he retreated further from the world that had once adored him. She speaks of these moments with a kind of quiet reverence, acknowledging the dignity with which he chose his final exit. To the world, Robert Redford was a symbol of grace, of Hollywood's golden era. A man who could balance rebelliousness and charm, who once captivated audiences as a rugged cowboy, a tenacious journalist, and the everyman you couldn't help but root for. But at home, he was just Bob, a man who lived quietly, with minimal routines, in a home far removed from the glitz and glamour that had made him famous. For him, fame was never a prize, but a burden, something to escape rather than embrace. As his wife recalls, Robert Redford didn't fear the public. He feared the version of himself they had created. He feared the expectations, the label of legend that hung over him like a weight. As the Sundance Festival grew in prestige, so did his discomfort with being the center of attention. It was never about the fame. It was about the person he had become in the eyes of others, a version of himself he couldn't quite recognize. His retreat from public life was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but in the end, it became undeniable. He avoided media, stopped attending events, and slowly, even his family began to see that something was changing in him. He didn't want to be remembered as the idolized man on screen, but as the quiet man who walked alone in the woods at dawn, a man who could still find peace in the simple beauty of nature. But as his wife tells it, the decision was his alone. She knew that Robert Redford wasn't succumbing to illness in the traditional sense. His soul had been leaving long before his body had. This was his choice, his decision to disappear before time could take it from him. He didn't want a grand farewell or a tribute. He didn't want to be remembered with applause or fanfare. He wanted to slip away quietly, to fade into the mountains he had always loved, and to leave behind only the quiet whispers of those who had truly known him. As his final days unfolded, his wife was not only his partner, but his witness. And though his final moments were marked by silence, they were also marked by the quiet strength and elegance that had defined his life. In choosing to leave the world as he had lived in it, he left behind a legacy that, while not as loud as the fame he had once known, was far deeper and more lasting. It was a lesson in how to live with grace, and perhaps even more importantly, how to die with it. As Robert Redford's wife reflects on their time together, she recalls the journey of a man who was both larger than life and profoundly ordinary in his private world. The public persona of Robert Redford, the charismatic, ruggedly handsome actor who captivated audiences with his performances, was a stark contrast to the man he was behind closed doors. He was not the star who graced the covers of magazines or attended lavish Hollywood parties. At home, he was Bob, the man who cherished solitude, the one who preferred the company of nature to the artificial glamour of the film industry. Redford's early years were shaped by an environment far removed from the bright lights of Hollywood. Born and raised in a modest family, he was far from the privileged image that many would later associate with him. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he learned the value of hard work and humility early on. His parents, while loving and supportive, were not of the Hollywood elite, and they instilled in him the belief that success was earned, not handed to you. His childhood was not without its struggles, but it was during these formative years that he developed the quiet determination that would later define him. His rise to fame was not a result of chance, but a culmination of his passion for acting, his determination to prove himself, and his willingness to take risks. In his early career, Robert Redford struggled to land substantial roles, but his persistence eventually paid off when he was cast in films that would change the trajectory of his life. From his breakout role in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to The Way We Were and All the President's Men, Redford quickly became a household name. But despite his success, he remained an enigma to those around him. While his public image was that of a man who had it all, success, fame, and adoration, his personal life was far more complex. He never quite seemed to fit the mold of the typical Hollywood star. Redford was not interested in the limelight the way many of his contemporaries were. He avoided the media circus and steered clear of the paparazzi, preferring instead to spend his time in the quiet solitude of his home or at his beloved Sundance Ranch in Utah. The sprawling mountains that surrounded him became his sanctuary, offering him a refuge from the world that constantly sought his attention. His love for the outdoors was more than just a hobby. It was a reflection of his deeper need for peace and solitude. The mountains were where he could strip away the expectations and demands that came with being Robert Redford. There he could simply be himself, not the actor, not the icon, but Bob. He often woke before sunrise, taking long walks alone in the wilderness. The solitude allowed him to reconnect with the natural world and escape the pressures of fame. It was during these early mornings that he found the clarity and calm that seemed to elude him in his public life. But even in his retreat, Redford was a man of great depth. He didn't shy away from exploring the complexities of his own identity, nor did he shy away from the deeper questions of life. He was a man who understood the fleeting nature of fame and the hollow promises it offered. His fame, though vast, never satisfied him in the way that his love for the land and the quiet moments with those he loved did. Despite the accolades, he often spoke of the emptiness he felt when he realized that being a star was not enough. As his wife recalls, Robert Redford was never truly comfortable with being idolized. He saw it as a form of captivity, a role that had been thrust upon him by the very industry that made him a star. Over time, this tension between the man he wanted to be and the man the world saw him as began to take its toll. Redford's disillusionment with Hollywood and the pressures of fame grew more pronounced as the years went by. He founded the Sundance Institute in 1981, not just as a way to preserve the creative spirit of independent film, but as a means of distancing himself from the celebrity culture he had grown to despise. The festival became a sanctuary for filmmakers who, like him, sought to create art without the constraints of mainstream Hollywood. But even as the festival grew in prominence, Redford remained a private figure, increasingly distant from the public eye. His wife describes a man who was never fully at peace with his fame. Robert Redford didn't want to be the face of Hollywood, she says. He wanted to be the man who could disappear into the mountains, who could live quietly and simply. But even in his desire for solitude, he could not escape the image that had been created for him. The world saw him as a legend, but to him, it was a label he never embraced. His life, both in and out of the spotlight, was a constant battle between who he was and who the world expected him to be. As the years passed, Redford withdrew even further from the public eye. He stopped attending events, avoided interviews, and retreated to his home, where he could live on his own terms. His wife witnessed this gradual withdrawal, and, though it pained her, she understood it. For Redford, disappearing was not an act of avoidance, but of choice. He chose to step back from the spotlight, to leave behind the public persona that had defined him for so long. The mountains, the quiet moments with his family, and the solitude he had longed for were now his reality. It was in these final years that he found a kind of peace, not in the world's adoration, but in the stillness of his own mind and heart. As Robert Redford's story progressed into the latter part of his life, the external success that the world saw became less relevant to him. What mattered more was the profound personal transformation he was undergoing, a transformation that many close to him observed but could not quite understand. His retreat into solitude wasn't a sudden decision, nor was it a result of a single event. Rather, it was a slow, deliberate process of withdrawal, a retreat from a life that had once defined him but was no longer satisfying his inner needs. And as his wife recounts, it wasn't until the end that the full extent of his journey into himself became clear. The events leading to his final days were not marked by dramatic hospital visits or a string of public appearances that could easily explain his decision to disappear from the public eye. Instead, they were a series of quiet choices that built up over time, a gradual descent into isolation that, in its own way, was as deliberate as any career move he had ever made. His wife remembers those days with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. She recalls how Robert, a man who had spent much of his life in the limelight, slowly distanced himself from that world in the most personal and intimate ways possible. It wasn't a rebellion or a rejection of fame. It was something deeper. In the final years of his life, Robert stopped responding to calls, no longer engaged in the usual social rituals that most people would consider essential. He stopped attending award ceremonies, giving interviews, or even picking up the phone for personal calls. And yet, the world continued to revere him, not understanding that the man they admired no longer existed in the way they thought. It was as though the world was still holding onto a version of Robert Redford that was no longer present, and he was letting them, no longer fighting to preserve the image that had once defined him. During those last years, he lived in the shadows of the very empire he had created, a man who had built a name and a life so rich in accomplishment that it became almost too heavy to bear. His success was not the source of his discontent. Instead, it was the demands of fame, the expectations, and the constant scrutiny. Robert Redford had never been a man to easily embrace the title of legend, a term that he regarded with skepticism and discomfort. He had always preferred to remain something of an enigma, and now, in the quiet of his home, he was making the ultimate decision to fade into obscurity. His wife vividly recalls the first time she noticed the signs of his withdrawal from the world around him. It wasn't a sudden break. Rather, it was a slow unraveling, a process that began with small gestures, refusing to attend events, declining interviews, and ultimately, rejecting any form of social interaction that might remind him of his previous life. As she reflects, she says, he stopped wanting to be seen. He stopped wanting to be Robert Redford. It was as if the man he had been, the charismatic figure that Hollywood had adored, no longer resonated with the man he had become in his private moments. At the same time, his wife witnessed an increasing distance between him and his family. The man who had once been a father, a husband, and a symbol of achievement was now a man retreating into his memories, his thoughts, and the solitude he so desperately needed. He stopped engaging with the people who had once shared his life. Instead, he chose the mountains and the silence of his home, seeking solace in the very landscape that had been a part of his life for so long. The very places that had once given him peace now became his sanctuary, where he could exist without the weight of expectations. Redford's gradual withdrawal was not born of bitterness, but of a deep, almost spiritual exhaustion, a weariness from constantly being in the public eye, from having to conform to an image that he no longer recognized. His wife describes the feeling of helplessness she felt during this period. She knew that he was not just withdrawing from the world, but also from the person he had once been. And yet, she could do little to stop it. It wasn't that he was fading away because of illness, but that he was intentionally fading out of the role that had been assigned to him by the world, she explains. In those final days, the man who had once captivated audiences with his charm and intensity was no longer concerned with leaving behind a legacy. His legacy, for him, was already written in the work he had done, the films he had made, and the people he had touched. What he now sought was something deeper, a peace that could only be found in the absence of all that had once defined him. And as his wife recounts, the quietness of their last moments together was a reflection of his choice to disappear. He wanted to die not as Robert Redford, but as the man who walked alone in the mountains, she says. He didn't want to be remembered as a Hollywood icon. He wanted to be remembered as a man who had lived on his own terms. A man who, at the very end, chose to walk away from it all. The final moments of his life, when they arrived, were exactly as he had wanted them. Quiet, serene, and undramatic. His wife recalls the stillness of the room in those last hours, the absence of noise, of commotion, of anything that would break the silence he had so carefully cultivated. When he passed away, it was in the same way he had lived, without fanfare, without recognition, and without anyone standing by to witness the end of an era. It was a departure that mirrored his life, a retreat from the spotlight, a decision to leave behind the persona and embrace the quietude that he had so long craved. As the world learned of his death, the headlines praised him as a legend, an icon, and a giant of American cinema. But for his wife, Robert Redford's last moments were not defined by the world's adulation. They were defined by the peace he had sought, by the quiet decision to disappear on his own terms. In the end, it was not the films he left behind, but the manner in which he chose to exit that would become his true legacy. As Robert Redford's wife reflects on the consequences of his decision to withdraw from the world, it becomes clear that his choice to step back was not just a personal retreat. It had far-reaching effects on the people closest to him. His family, his friends, and even his colleagues witnessed the slow, inevitable unraveling of a man who had once been one of Hollywood's brightest stars. While Redford may have found solace in his solitude, those around him struggled to understand the depth of his need for isolation. His decision to retreat from the public wasn't simply about avoiding fame. It was about confronting something deeper, the toll that fame had taken on his soul. For his wife, the effects of his withdrawal were deeply personal. As someone who had been by his side through the highs and lows of his career, she understood the complexities of his inner world. But even with this understanding, there were moments of profound sadness as she watched the man she loved slip further away from her and from everyone who had once been close to him. She describes the emotional distance that grew between them, even as they shared the same space. It wasn't that they were no longer in love. It was that Redford's emotional energy, once so vibrant and full of life, had faded, leaving behind a man who seemed almost unreachable. His wife recalls how the house that once buzzed with activity, visits from friends, discussions about films, and the occasional flurry of social engagements, became eerily quiet. Redford's retreat didn't just affect his public appearances. It affected the rhythm of their daily life. The once lively conversations became sparse, replaced by long silences. The man who had been the center of so much attention was now a shadow of himself, and the absence of his presence left a palpable void. For his wife, this was the most difficult aspect of his withdrawal. Not the absence of applause or fame, but the emotional distance that he had created. For his children, Robert's retreat was equally hard to comprehend. His role as a father, once so central to his identity, became secondary as he began to shed the layers of his public persona. His children, though grown, found it difficult to understand why their father, who had been so active in their lives during their younger years, had now become a distant figure. His decision to retreat from the world also meant retreating from them, and they, too, had to grapple with the loss of the father they had known. In the quiet of their family home, they could feel the absence of the man who had once been their rock, their source of strength and wisdom. Even those who had worked with him over the years felt the impact of his retreat. Redford had always been known for his integrity, his dedication to his craft, and his willingness to stand up for what he believed in. But as he retreated from the world, even his colleagues began to notice a change. They spoke of a man who had once been a vibrant force in the industry, but who had slowly withdrawn from the very industry that had made him famous. His refusal to participate in the machinery of Hollywood, the interviews, the premieres, the endless awards ceremonies, left many of his peers bewildered. Redford had always been someone who operated on his own terms, but now it seemed he was withdrawing not just from the fame, but from the very essence of the industry he had helped shape. His decision to step back from everything, to avoid the cameras and the applause, had consequences that rippled through his personal and professional circles. In the eyes of the public, it seemed like he was giving up on everything he had worked for. But those who knew him well understood that this wasn't about abandoning his legacy. It was about choosing a different path, one that allowed him to die with dignity on his own terms, rather than being swallowed by the expectations of others. In a world that often values fame above all else, Redford's choice was a radical one. He chose to embrace silence, to let go of the persona that had once defined him, and to live and die in peace. The effect on his wife, in particular, was profound. She had been with him through everything, the triumphs, the struggles, and the moments of joy. But in his final years, she found herself standing beside a man who, in many ways, had become a stranger. She often describes the sense of helplessness that came with watching him fade away, knowing that there was nothing she could do to stop it. She couldn't bring him back to the man he had been. All she could do was stand by him, silently witnessing the end of a chapter that had spanned decades. She speaks of the pain of watching the man she loved, the man who had been a symbol of strength and resilience, slowly disappear into the quiet of his own mind. But as much as his withdrawal was painful for those around him, it was also a final act of control, a way for Robert Redford to reclaim something that had been lost over the years, his autonomy. In a career defined by public scrutiny, he had never had the chance to be truly alone, to live outside the confines of fame. Now, in his final days, he had that chance. And it was in those moments of solitude, in the quiet of his home, that he found the peace he had long been searching for. In the end, Redford's retreat wasn't a sign of weakness or a desire to escape the world. It was a decision to face his own mortality on his own terms. His decision to remove himself from the public eye, to stop playing the role of the icon, was an act of profound self-awareness. He understood that fame, while it had given him much, had also taken from him. And so, he chose to step away, to let go, and to disappear in the same quiet, dignified way that he had lived. For his wife, the greatest challenge was not the physical absence of the man she had shared her life with, but the emotional distance that had grown between them. But she also understands that this was Robert's way of facing the end. His life had been one of intense public scrutiny, and his final days were his gift to himself, a chance to exit the stage on his own terms, without the clamor of applause or the weight of expectations. In the final years of Robert Redford's life, as he deliberately distanced himself from the world, there were moments of profound reflection and quiet reckoning. His wife, the last person to witness the man he had become, recounts not just the larger, more noticeable changes in his life, but also the private, intimate moments that defined his inner journey. These were the silent battles, the unspoken truths, and the personal revelations that Redford chose to share with only a select few. As his life wound down, there were hidden stories, often revealed only through the smallest gestures, that told of a man at war with himself, with his own image, and with the expectations that had been thrust upon him by the world. There were many who saw Robert Redford only as a cinematic icon, the quintessential heartthrob, the rugged cowboy with a soul of integrity. But his wife knew the man beneath the surface, the man who grappled with the pressure of being viewed through the lens of public adoration. She speaks of moments when, in the privacy of their home, Robert would let his guard down, revealing the complexities that the world never saw. There were times when they would sit in silence, not exchanging words, but understanding each other in ways that no conversation could capture. It was in these silences that Robert's true vulnerability came to light, the vulnerability that had been hidden behind the public persona of Hollywood's golden boy. One of the most intimate stories his wife shares is of their shared moments in the mountains. Robert had always found solace in nature, in the quiet solitude of the vast wilderness surrounding his home. For him, the mountains were not just a retreat. They were a place of self-discovery and peace. His wife recalls how, even in his final years, he would often go for long walks in the woods, sometimes with a notebook in hand, other times just to clear his mind. These walks were not for show. They were for him, a way to reconnect with the person he had been before fame had consumed him. During these moments, it wasn't Robert Redford the icon that he was trying to find. It was simply Bob, the man who had always loved the quiet beauty of the natural world. But even in these quiet moments, there was an underlying sense of sadness, of unfinished business. Redford's wife remembers him often staring into the distance, lost in thought, as if he were trying to make sense of everything he had accomplished and everything he had sacrificed along the way. She recalls how, during these walks, he would sometimes speak about his past, about his career, and about the cost of fame. It was in these vulnerable moments that Robert would admit the truth he had long kept hidden. Fame had not brought him the happiness or fulfillment he had hoped for. Instead, it had isolated him, left him disconnected from the very people and things that had once mattered most. His wife also speaks of the rare occasions when he would open up about the deeper emotional struggles that haunted him. It wasn't just the pressures of being a public figure that weighed on him, but the personal losses he had experienced throughout his life. There was the death of his younger brother, a loss that had left an indelible mark on him, and the pain of seeing the world's perception of him shift over time. In these conversations, Robert often wrestled with the question of legacy. He wondered, at times, whether his legacy would be defined by the roles he had played on screen or by the man he was behind closed doors. But what stands out most in his wife's account of their last years together is the profound sense of peace that seemed to come over him in the final months of his life. Though he had spent so much of his life avoiding attention, rejecting the idea of being a legend, there was a quiet acceptance in him as the end drew near. It wasn't a resignation or a surrender to the inevitable. It was a peaceful letting go. Robert had spent years building a life on his own terms, and now, as he neared the end, he was choosing to let go of the last vestiges of that life. He had long ago shed the need for public adoration, and now he was shedding the need for the public itself. In the days before his death, Robert's wife recalls the quietude that surrounded him. There was no frantic rushing to hospitals, no frantic final attempts to fix what couldn't be fixed. Instead, Robert spent his final moments in the same way he had lived much of his life, in silence, in peace, surrounded by the natural beauty that had always grounded him. His wife remembers how, during those final days, he would speak only in whispers, sharing fleeting moments of wisdom or love with her. The words he chose to speak were few, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. One of the most poignant moments she shares is when Robert, in his final days, spoke about how he wanted to be remembered. He told her, "Don't let them remember me as the man the world created. Let them remember me as the man I was." It was a final plea for authenticity, for his true self to be seen and remembered, not the persona that Hollywood had crafted for him. His wife understood this more deeply than anyone else, and it was in that moment that she realized just how profoundly Robert had been shaped by his struggle with fame and identity. As Robert Redford's wife reflects on their last days together, she acknowledges the profound impact that his choice to disappear had on their relationship. It was both a heartbreaking and beautiful experience. Heartbreaking because she had to let go of the man she had loved for so long, but beautiful because she witnessed him make a decision that allowed him to die on his own terms. It was, in her eyes, the final act of a man who had always been in control of his life, but who, in the end, chose to surrender control to something greater than fame, greater than the world's expectations. He chose to surrender to peace. As Robert Redford's final days unfolded, the true significance of his life began to take shape in the quiet moments of reflection. His wife, the one who had witnessed the gradual unraveling of the man he once was, could not help but see the deeper meaning behind the way he chose to end his life. While the world continued to view him as a star, a legend whose legacy was etched in Hollywood's history, those closest to him saw the complexity of a man who was, in many ways, retreating from the very image the world had created for him. Redford's decision to step away from the public eye was not a response to illness or depression, but rather a conscious choice to live the final chapter of his life on his own terms. He had spent decades under the microscope, scrutinized and adored for his work on the screen, for the roles that had defined him as the quintessential American hero. But in the end, he sought nothing more than peace. He didn't want to be remembered as the iconic star who had graced every major film set or red carpet. Instead, he wanted to be remembered as the man who had chosen to disappear in silence, away from the chaos of fame. For Robert, the decision to withdraw from the public was, in itself, an act of profound self-awareness. He understood the fleeting nature of fame, how easily it could consume a person and obscure the essence of who they truly were. In his final years, he came to terms with the fact that his true self, the man behind the actor, would never be fully understood by the public. The persona they had created for him was one he could never fully escape. But by retreating into solitude, he reclaimed his own narrative. He could, in his last moments, find a kind of freedom that had eluded him for much of his life. His wife reflects on how, in those final months, Robert had come to terms with his own mortality. It wasn't the fear of death that seemed to concern him, but rather the notion of leaving a legacy that was true to who he had been, not who others had imagined him to be. It was clear to her that, while his films would live on, it was the moments of quiet reflection, the time spent in nature, and the personal connections he had forged that would define his true legacy. Redford's legacy was never about awards or recognition. It was about authenticity. As his wife watched him in his final days, she saw a man who had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of, yet had realized that true fulfillment came not from the adoration of others, but from the peace of knowing he had lived a life true to himself. The finality of his departure was not just an end, but the culmination of a life that had been defined by choices, by moments when he had stepped away from the expectations of the world and chosen to live on his own terms. In his final days, Robert Redford spoke little, but the words he did speak carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of reflection. He told his wife that he didn't want to be remembered as the actor, the director, or the legend. He simply wanted to be remembered as Bob, the man who had walked alone in the mountains, who had chosen to live his life quietly, away from the spotlight. His desire to fade into obscurity was not an act of bitterness or regret, but rather one of peace. He had spent his life building a career based on what others expected of him, but in the end, he chose to die on his own terms. As Robert's wife reflects on their time together, she sees the lessons he left behind. He taught her that greatness does not need to be defined by accolades or applause. True greatness, he showed her, lies in the ability to live with integrity and authenticity, even when the world is clamoring for something else. It is about being true to oneself, even when that means stepping away from the very things that once brought recognition and fame. Redford's decision to disappear quietly, without fanfare or ceremony, was the ultimate act of personal freedom. It was a final expression of his desire to live and die without the constraints of public expectation. And, as his wife sees it, that is the true essence of his legacy. In a world that often values fame above all else, Redford chose to reject it in favor of something far more meaningful: peace, solitude, and the freedom to be himself. In the days after his death, as the world mourned the loss of a legend, his wife was left with a profound understanding of who he truly was. Robert Redford's legacy, in her eyes, was not the public persona that had defined him for so long, but the quiet man who had chosen to disappear into the mountains, to live and die on his own terms. It was the man who had shown her, in his final days, that the true measure of a person's life is not in the applause they receive, but in the authenticity with which they live it. Robert Redford's final moments were not a dramatic farewell to the world, but a peaceful departure, the result of a lifetime spent seeking peace and authenticity. His wife's reflections on their time together serve as a reminder that, in the end, it is not fame or fortune that defines us, but the choices we make, the integrity with which we live, and the peace we find within ourselves. As Robert Redford's life came to a close, his wife stood as the final witness to his departure, reflecting on the incredible journey they had shared. It was in the silence of his last days that she truly understood the depth of his legacy, a legacy that had little to do with the world's admiration and everything to do with the way he chose to live and die. Robert Redford's death wasn't marked by a grand public farewell or a final curtain call in front of cameras. Instead, it was an intimate, quiet, and deeply personal moment, a choice to leave the world without fanfare in the same way he had often lived his life, removed from the expectations of others. The absence of an overt, dramatic send-off seemed to perfectly encapsulate the man he had been. Redford, a man who had spent decades in the spotlight, had long since retreated from it, seeking peace and solitude. He didn't want to be remembered as a Hollywood legend or an icon. He wanted to be remembered as Bob, the quiet man who had found solace in the mountains and in the simple moments of life. His decision to exit the stage of life quietly, without the dramatic flair that one might expect from such a renowned figure, was, in its own way, the most fitting conclusion to his life story. For his wife, the final moments were both heartbreaking and profound. As she stood beside him, she was not only saying goodbye to the man she had loved for so long, but to the man who had always been a mystery to the public. To the world, he was Robert Redford, the star, the actor, the director, the legend. But to her, he was simply Bob, the man who had chosen to live away from the spotlight, who had found peace in the quiet corners of the world that so few knew about. It was this man, the one she had shared her life with, that she mourned. The man who had shown her that true greatness wasn't measured by fame or fortune, but by the authenticity of one's choices. In the days following his passing, the world mourned the loss of an icon. Headlines hailed him as a legend, a figure whose contribution to cinema was unmatched. But those who knew him best understood that Robert Redford's true legacy wasn't in the films he made or the accolades he received. It was in the quiet moments he shared with his loved ones, in the way he chose to live his life on his own terms, and in the decision to quietly slip away from the world he had once conquered. As his wife reflects on his final moments, she sees the beauty in the simplicity of his exit. It was an exit that defied the expectations of the world, a world that would have wanted him to go out with a bang, to leave behind a final statement. Instead, Redford chose the silence that had been so important to him in his final years. He had spent his life running from the public persona that had been built around him, and in his final moments, he chose to vanish quietly, without the world ever truly understanding the depth of his inner world. In many ways, Redford's death was a reflection of his entire life, a life defined not by the applause or recognition of others, but by the personal choices he made. He had always valued authenticity over fame, solitude over spectacle. And in his final days, he chose to leave the world as he had lived, on his own terms. His wife, as the final person to bear witness to this choice, understands more than anyone the power of that decision. It was a decision that, in its quiet simplicity, spoke volumes about the man he had been. As she reflects on their shared years, she realizes that Robert's life was not defined by what he did for the world, but by what he did for himself. The world saw him as a legend, but in the end, he was just a man who had spent his life seeking peace, seeking authenticity, and finally finding it in his final moments. His death, though silent, was his final act of defiance against the world's expectations, a defiance that was not born of anger, but of quiet dignity. In the end, the true measure of Robert Redford's life is not found in the roles he played or the fame he amassed. It is found in the way he lived, in the way he chose to disappear when the world expected him to stay. It is in the peace he found in the mountains, in the silences he shared with his wife, and in the way he embraced his mortality on his own terms. Robert Redford's legacy, as his wife now understands, is not a legacy of fame or fortune, but one of quiet authenticity and personal choice. As the final chapter of his life closed, Robert Redford left behind a lesson that many may never fully understand, that sometimes the most profound acts are the quietest ones. His life and his death were not about being remembered or celebrated. They were about being true to oneself, about living and dying with dignity, and about finding peace in a world that often demands everything but that. For his wife, this is the lesson that will stay with her forever. The lesson that in a world full of noise, sometimes the greatest act of love is simply to say goodbye in silence.